everybody. Welcome back to what I have affectionately started calling the Basement Bible Study, for no other reason than we are in my basement. I wish we could be together in person, but unfortunately the times do not allow that to safely happen. Anyway, this evening we're going to start exploring the Gospel of John. And in this short video, I want to take just a few minutes to start telling you some of the background of John, some information about it, a lot of stuff that I would generally classify as kind of theology dork kind of stuff. But that's who I am. So I kind of enjoy it. I think it's interesting. And I think for just in general, this isn't necessarily knowledge that you have to know on a daily basis or anything like that. But it's information that lends to the credibility of the things that we believe. If we are going to place so much faith in the things that we read in the Bible, I think it's a really good idea for us to understand where it comes from, why we believe it, and what credibility it has. So to that end, we're going to talk a little bit about the authorship of the book, the dating of the book, and the audience of the book, to whom it was written, because that also helps us understand the context and why John felt the need to write it when there were already 3 other Gospels. So let's begin with authorship. Now, tradition holds that John was written by the Apostle John. This is the same John we see who is the son of Zebedee. He is called in Matthew 4:21, and his brother is James. They were both fishermen. There is a little bit of disagreement over the authorship. Most of that stems from sort of a lack of continuity in the series of the events recorded, and also some geographic disagreements is probably the wrong word, but I can't think of the right word, but inconsistencies geographically maybe would be the best way to say it. But that said, the majority of scholarly sources do seem to agree on its apostolic origins. And, you know, a very poor definition of an apostolic origin would essentially mean that there is a direct line from Jesus to what we have now. And we'll talk a little bit more about sort of that line here in a minute, or why we think that line exists. Now, the authorship question, those inconsistencies that are there, can largely be explained if you look at the process that John was likely using to put the gospel together, how it was then compiled and made into the book that we have today. And we think of this in 3 stages. Now, this is coming from a book published by Oxford. I will try and remember to put the link down in the description if anybody really wants to look it up. You can see where I got most of this information. Anyway, in stage 1 of this would have been the time that John passed his experiences orally on to his followers. And this would include his experiences directly with Jesus during Jesus' ministry in Judea and Galilee. And again, this would have been passed on orally. Most things were passed on orally to an extent at that time. And it's not kind of like the way we pass things on orally now, where things get all misconstrued and discombobulated. The oral transmission of knowledge was a very, very disciplined and rigorous practice. So we have good reason to believe that what was passed on is accurate, as you know, John was an eyewitness to these events. So we have good reason to believe in the accuracy of these things. And the second stage of this, which would have likely occurred in Ephesus, his disciples would have written John's teachings down. And it's not unusual for a teacher or a disciple like John to have people who would write these things down. The old term for it, and I'm going to butcher this, but is an amanuensis. I probably got that wrong, and my school teachers would be upset with me. But again, this would be fairly consistent with what we know about how things were done in that day and age. Finally, the third stage likely followed John's death somewhere on or about 98 A.D. And this is when John's followers would have put together a final copy into more of a compiled version. It's likely that his followers could have added some sort of an introduction or an epilogue to the original manuscript. We don't know for sure if they would have done that or John would have had something done or what. But we do have good reason to believe that the information presented in John is faithfully transmitted through that. Now let's look a little bit at the date of the writing. There's fairly good reason to believe that John was written very early and that we can trust the fidelity of the original manuscripts. There are two papyrus or papyri that have been discovered by archaeologists, and those date, the first is the Rylands papyrus, dates between 135 and 150 AD. It contains verses from John chapter 18. The second is the Egerton papyrus, the Egerton II papyrus, which was dated to about 150 AD. This contains parts of John and parts of the other three Gospels. And one of the things to keep in mind with these papyrus is it takes time to transmit them through the world, in which they would have existed. So even though we think John probably died somewhere around 98 AD, the appearance of papyrus that close, in the 135 to 150 AD, suggests that it's been pretty well circulated, which takes time to do. And that helps us understand the date of the writing. A couple other things. In chapter 9, verse 22, and chapter 16, verse 2, there are references to something known as the test benediction. Now, this was a situation created by Rabbi Gamaliel II. And again, I might be butchering that name, so apologies if I did. And he created this test benediction somewhere around 85 to 90 AD. The intent was to exclude those Jews who were proclaiming Jesus as the Messiah. It was intended to cut them off from the temple and to socially ostracize them, and really to pressure them to reject their new Christian faith and return to the more traditional Judaism. Continuing with the date, John is also used by some of the earliest of the church followers. Theophilus credited John with authorship of this gospel as early as 180 AD. Irenaeus also quoted John somewhere about 200 AD and claimed John lived until the time of Emperor Trajan, which began in 98 AD. That's why I was saying on or about 98 AD we think he passed. Irenaeus himself also presents a source very near to John. He was the student of Polycarp, who was a disciple of John himself, and that's kind of the apostolic line that I was talking about. It went, John to Polycarp to Irenaeus, so we can track that back. And of course, we have a number of Irenaeus' writings. I think there's one or two on my bookshelf. I don't know if I've ever actually read them. They make me look smart or something. Anyway, so why did John write the book? What's the purpose? According to what I've been reading, John was largely targeting two distinct groups. The first were known as dispersion Jews, and those were largely the Jews who had adopted Jesus as their Savior, as the Messiah, and had become Christians. The second were Hellenistic Jews, or Greek Jews. We'll talk about first the dispersion Jews. These were the folks caught between loyalty to Jewish tradition, like I said, and the belief in Jesus Christ as the Messiah. Now, these folks would have been caught up in the test benediction. So these were the people that process or loyalty oath or, whatever, however you want to think about it, was meant to essentially persecute and ostracize. Now, they would have thought of Jesus as fully human, but not fully divine. And some of this, I think, has to do with the monotheism and the strange conundrum that kind of having Jesus claiming to be God, but also only believing in one God created. Trinitarian thought was not necessarily as well developed as it is today. And let's be honest, it's still kind of confusing today. Now, the Hellenistic Jews, they would have held a view that Jesus was more fully divine, but not fully human. These folks, I don't think, necessarily would have been under the test benediction, so we're not concerned about their persecution necessarily, but we are concerned about that, or John was concerned about them having an accurate understanding of the claims that Christ made, which was to be fully human and fully divine, not one or the other. that's about all I've got for the background of John. I'm sure I know that there's a lot more. I certainly read a bit more, but these are kind of the highlights of what John was going for, who he's trying to write to, who he was, and why we believe that the book is authentic. In the next video, we'll start into the book of John. I look forward to seeing you there.